Shalom. This week I want to talk to you about the holiness of God. In so doing, I want to give you all a glimpse of the immensely powerful, living being that is the God of Israel. When we mention holiness, most people think of goodness, kindness, sinlessness, purity, righteousness, and so on. In the rabbinic way of thinking, it means being separate from the ordinary and the physical. However, all of these things are secondary. Now I would venture to guess that to most of us, even to those of us who firmly believe in God, that God remains a purely theological concept, whose existence can only be taken as a matter of faith. However, there is one group of people for whom God becomes very real: prophets. For prophets, God is not just a voice one hears in one's head. God is a very powerful force that seizes hold of their lives, a living being who is so overwhelming in nature that these men and women shudder in trembling awe at what they experience, and are never the same again. For example, Isaiah feared for his life when he had his visions. Thereafter, the driving force behind his message was the holiness of God. So to understand holiness in the Israelite way of thinking, you have to first learn something about the awesome nature of the God of Israel. God's holiness is inextricably linked to his physical unapproachableness. The God of Israel is absolutely spiritually approachable. Our God is closer to us than our own breathing. But if we were to experience God the way that the seraphim in heaven experience God, the fiery angels that dwell in the immediate presence of God, then we would all be burnt to a crisp. Take the experience of Moses on Mount Sinai. In Exodus chapter 33, Moses asks God to show him his glory, his kavod. God says that he will cause his glory to pass by. God adds that Moses will need to be protected from his glory, since, as God puts it, no one can see my face and live. As God passes by, God has to shield Moses from his glory. Moses is told that he may only see God's back. We might ask, what is this about? What is so powerful about God that Moses has to be protected from God? And what is this talk of face and back? There is also the episode of Aaron's sons who are killed because they were not properly prepared before entering the tent of God's presence. Again, they died because they came into contact with the full force of God's glory. In many places while the Israelites are in the Sinai, the Israelites are warned not to approach the tent of meeting, lest they die. Notice it does not say, "or else I will kill them," but rather God is saying that if they are not properly prepared, they will die as a direct consequence of coming into contact with the powerfully brilliant, fiery radiance of God's glory. In other places, God is described as coming in fire and smoke, such as when God comes down on Mount Sinai. In Exodus 24:17, God is described as consuming fire. And in the vision of Ezekiel, again God is described as a vision of light and fire. I must emphasize here that the light and the fire are not God. They are merely the effect that God's presence has on this world. In Exodus 24:10, when Moses, Aaron, and 70 elders see the God of Israel, what they see is the back of the glory, the same as Moses saw in Exodus 33. Now, I've spent most of this lecture talking about God's glory. When I say glory, I'm not talking about magnificence. I'm talking about the brilliant, fiery light that is God's glory. Now, some people will have difficulty believing any of this, even though the story of the wandering in the desert and the experiences of the prophets mention it at every turn. So to you I say, my friends, you already believe in a God you cannot see or touch. Is it easier for you to believe in a God who has no effect on you at all? One that you can define on your own terms? One that you can control? A safe God you can turn on and off when you wish? Is it so uncomfortable to believe in a strong, mighty, and awesomely powerful God? During the wanderings of the Israelites in the desert, they were given instructions on how to construct the tabernacle, or in Hebrew, Mishkan. This was built ostensibly to house God's presence. I want to tell you about the actual primary purpose of the Mishkan. What Moses experienced on Mount Sinai was an opening between heaven and earth, a kind of doorway, one that allowed him to see heaven and the light of God's glory, the glory that suffuses all things there. What he saw was the face and back of this doorway. God would have been able to open this doorway anywhere, at any time. Moses had asked God to travel with his people, but if God's glory opened up amongst the Israelites, they would have all been destroyed. So the Mishkan was built to allow a doorway to God's glory in heaven to appear above the ark, but while so doing, also protecting the Israelites. That was the main purpose of the Mishkan, to protect the Israelites from the power of God's glory. If we as the people of God are to set ourselves on the right spiritual path, then we need to have the right understanding of the power of this holiness. In the Sinai desert, the Israelites experienced a great and powerful being, a living entity beyond compare. This, my friends, is the great God who has guided us with his wisdom and justice throughout the ages. Now I have shown you something of the physical unapproachableness of God, that we cannot encounter God's glory without endangering our physical bodies. I want to tell you about a secondary aspect of holiness, moral purity, how God is incapable of sin or wrong. When prophets such as Malachi speak against injustice and wickedness, their speech is full of metaphors about God's justice being like a consuming fire, that it would consume the wicked but purify the good. Wickedness and injustice cannot stand before God, because the fire of his holiness will destroy it. So says Habakkuk 1:13. In Talmidi theology, it wasn't the blood sacrifices that brought about cleansing from sin, because if an unrepentant person offered a sacrifice, then there was no forgiveness. The purpose of the offering was to show what happens to our bodies if we were to approach God's glory. The fire of the altar was a symbol of God's throne and glory in heaven. However, repentance does allow a soul to approach God. It is the purity and power of the presence of God alone which cleanses us of our sin. A pure and perfect creation will not be harmed by God's fire. For example, when Moses saw the burning bush, he noticed that it was not consumed in the flames. This is because the plant is not capable of moral imperfection, and so is not harmed by the fire of God's glory. That is the primary effect of God's holiness, a moral purity that is able to destroy wickedness and injustice and cleanse us of our sin. There is a second aspect to the holiness of God, and that is the separation from all things common and physical. So this is what we have learned so far, that God's holiness is inextricably linked to his unapproachableness, that our bodies cannot physically approach God's glory. The second is the fact that when we can approach God spiritually, and that a repentant soul can be cleansed by God's glory. Everything else we are taught is to permanently remind us of God's power and holiness. In the Israelite religion, we are given commandments, or mitzvot, that remind us of God's holiness. Unfortunately, many people in ancient times, as well as today, get the wrong end of the stick. Take a look at what is considered unclean or unholy: the dead, a woman during her menstrual cycle, a man after a seminal emission, a man or woman after sexual intercourse, the sick, the blemished, the disabled, any bodily waste, and so on. Do you see what all these things have in common? The ancient rabbis interpreted these things as unholy because they were ordinary and everyday, but that is not what they have in common, not why they were ritually impure. What they have in common is that they are all normal, human, physical functions and frailties, the result of us having normal, mortal bodies. Due to our religious leaders having no idea of the reason behind our holy laws and teachings, we've been given the false impression that what is unclean and unholy is bad, wrong, and sinful. For example, sex has come to have the taint of sinfulness about it. I must emphasize that this is completely wrong. Ritual uncleanliness is not about teaching us that the body is wrong, that physical frailties are wrong, or that normal human desires and functions are wrong. Ritual uncleanliness is about teaching us that God does not have these functions, and that God has no physical body. There is one other thing that I want to clear up as well. The sick were not permitted to go to the temple, and the blemished and disabled were not allowed to serve God as priests. This has led people to think that God does not want us in our frail or vulnerable state. Again, this is us as human beings not understanding what God is about. So let me explain a different way of looking at this. At one time, healers were a normal part of the Israelite religion until they were banned. When we had them, we were able to understand that healers were messengers of God. So when you are sick or infirm or dying, you do not go to God. Instead, through healers, God comes to you. Ritual purification takes place after these times of sickness and human frailty, making a clean break between our times of health and wholeness, when we turn to God, and our times of weakness and imperfection, when God turns to us. Because we have lost these understandings, we have fallen prey to those who deceive us into thinking that God can take human form. If we remembered the power of God's glory, we would realize that it is impossible for such a powerful being to dwell in a human body, because it would be destroyed. If we remembered that the purpose of declaring human bodily functions as unclean was to impress upon us that God had no body, and therefore no bodily functions, we would be incapable of conceiving of a God who had a physical body. Because we have lost these understandings, we get the wrong impression of God's intent, and so see sex as sinful and illness as a time apart from God. And we no longer see God as a powerful living being who is able to direct us, care for us, and guide us. And because God is a holy being, because God is purifying and cleansing, God is the source of all moral and physical perfection. By following the customs and traditions of our people, we can actually program our hearts and minds to find this perfection. I want to tell you about a recent scientific discovery. There are certain people who have ongoing problems with chronic pain. For example, some people experience pain long after the source of the pain has healed. It was recently found that the brain had actually reprogrammed itself to expect the pain, and thereafter continue to experience the pain even though the injury was long healed. It has long been known by spiritual healers that one can reprogram the mind to assist with healing. Psychiatrists also have learned that one can realign our thought processes so that they are more positive, so that what has hurt us in the past no longer hurts us. By following certain rituals, with the intent that these rituals calm us and put us into a certain state of mind, that they will actually program the mind to thinking positively, being positive, and acting positively. The signs, symbols, and traditions of our heritage that mark us as a holy people are meant to remind us of the awesome and powerful nature of the God we follow and work for, and change our hearts and minds to being holy hearts and holy minds. A holy people is a light to the world, as God is a light to humanity. A holy people is an example of ethical and moral righteousness, as God is morally pure. A holy people works for justice, sweeping away injustice, just as the fire of our holy God cannot endure injustice and wrongdoing. And a holy people is a powerful people, as our holy God is a powerful God. I hope I have given you some insight into the living holiness of God and the power of God's glory. If we trust in God's holy ways, if we abide by the true understanding of a holy life and what a holy life is for, if we strive to be holy for our God, then we will become a powerful force for change, for good change in humanity, one that will not be able to stand before such a change, just as no one is able to stand before the holiness of God and remain unchanged. Shalom, and thank you for listening.